The house wasn't quiet. It was on pause, like even the air knew that behind those walls, a legend was going through something the world would never see on a red carpet. Outside, the name Brigitte Bardot was lighting up headlines and screens again. Inside, though, everything came down to slower breathing, careful steps, and the constant company of animals who didn't know the word fame but could sense the shake of an absence that was coming closer. Bernard Dormal wasn't a showbiz guy. He never was. And maybe that's why for years he was the only one who could live in Brigitte's last real space. Real life. No cameras, no makeup, no audience waiting for the perfect line. To the world, she was a symbol. To him, she was a real person who could get tired, get annoyed, suddenly laugh, cry out of nowhere, and most of all, refuse to be turned into just a pretty picture. Her last day didn't have the big drama that so many would imagine. There were no cold hospital lights or journalist flashes. There was no final speech made for history. There were routines. There were things in their places. There was a house that seemed to know every move by heart, and yet Bernard felt it early on. The day had a different weight. The way the silence fell over the furniture, the way she looked toward the garden like she was saying goodbye to something without naming it. For years, Brigitte had fiercely guarded a line between the world and her privacy. That was her last act of freedom, not letting old age or weakness be turned into entertainment. Bernard understood it not because it suited him, but because he'd seen what being exposed did to her. He'd seen how the world falls in love with an image, and then punishes the person when she stops fitting that image. That morning, according to people who were close, she spoke little, not because she couldn't, but because there were days when Brigitte chose to use fewer words as a safe place. Bernard stayed with her without pushing. In a house shared with animals, he learned that love can also be this, being close without demanding anything. A glass of water at the right moment, a blanket fixed without questions, a look that says, "I'm here," without making a show of it. Outside, the story was already getting ready. It always does. Some would say it was the end of an era, others that it was a controversial goodbye. People would talk about her beauty, her movies, her radical choice to quit acting. Her whole life turned into debate. But inside the house, time didn't have headlines. It had hours. Bernard remembered that day a thought that had come back to him many times like an echo. Brigitte wasn't an easy woman for the world to love, because the world usually wants women to be nice and pleasing. She chose to be free, and freedom, especially when you hold on to it for decades, comes with a price. They made hers pay for daring to be sensual without saying sorry. They made her pay for saying no to a life others wanted to plan for her. They even made her pay for her decision to protect animals with a passion that many never understood. In recent years, the house had become a kind of fortress, not because Bernard locked her in, but because she chose it that way. People mix up retreating with forced loneliness, but for Brigitte, retreating was a political choice, almost spiritual, a clean break from a system that ate her up when she was young. Bernard, far from being the main character, was the guardian of that choice, the man who spoke for her when she didn't want to anymore, the one who closed the door when the world knocked out of curiosity or nosiness. And that's where the question comes in that runs through this story like an underground current. Why, even in her last hours, was Brigitte Bardot still a battlefield? Because her death, even before it was understood, was already being used to judge her, idealize her, or attack her. What part of the world needs to turn a woman's ending into a verdict? Bernard felt it with painful clarity. The problem wasn't the death. The problem was what the world does with it. And in Brigitte's case, the world seemed unable to let her rest in peace without opening her life file one more time, because there was a second story running at the same time. The story almost nobody saw. The one of an ending without show, without poses, without the last image that feeds curiosity. A domestic, private, almost simple ending. And that simplicity was going to make a lot of people mad, because there are those who can't stand a legend slipping away without giving them one last scene. Bernard wouldn't say it in public. He was never a guy for interviews or emotional press conferences. But that day, in those hours, a certainty settled in his chest like a stone. Brigitte was leaving, like she had lived her last years, closing the door. Not out of fear, out of control, out of dignity, out of that special kind of courage that means not giving your ending away to anyone. The news didn't come into the house like a shout. It came like a distant whisper. Unavoidable. Bernard Dormal knew it even before the phones started buzzing. There are moments when life changes state without warning, like when the sea pulls back the tide quietly. For him, it wasn't the death of Brigitte Bardot, it was the sudden absence of a presence that had filled every corner for decades. While outside the media sharpened headlines and looked for final words, inside the house time seemed frozen. Bernard walked through rooms he knew by heart, but that suddenly felt different. The animals, dogs, cats, quiet bodies used to reading feelings, moved with a strange rest, to lessness, like they understood something important had changed. Nobody cried in a loud way. That wasn't the style of that house. Grief there was always held in, almost fiercely private. Very soon, the first reactions started leaking in from outside. Official messages, carefully written statements, tributes that mixed real sadness with taking advantage. Bernard watched them go by like someone seeing a storm through a closed window. He knew that for the world, Brigitte couldn't die without turning into debate again. They would talk about her beauty, her movies, her early retirement, and always her controversies, like death was one last invite to judge. But Bernard wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the Brigitte almost nobody knew. The one who woke up early to check on the animals before herself. The one who could sit for hours in silence, facing the sea, without needing to fill the quiet with words. The one who deeply hated the idea of becoming a living relic, shown off for other people's nostalgia. That woman was the one he chose to love, not the myth. The world always wanted a fixed Brigitte, frozen in one image, young, provocative, forever. She, instead, chose to move, change, even disappear. Bernard came into her life when that decision was already made. He didn't come to save her or change her. He came to go with her in a conscious retreat, and over time, that turned into a quiet alliance against constant intrusion. There were hard moments, of course. Living with a legend isn't living with a memory. It's living with a story that never stops casting shadows. Every unexpected visit, every letter, every interview attempt was a test. Bernard quickly understood that his role wasn't to speak for her, but to protect her, right not to speak, not to explain, not to justify. In those hours after, while the world started rebuilding her life in review, Bernard remembered how it all started between them. It wasn't a movie story. There was no big seduction. There was connection, a shared understanding, born from both hating exposure. He came from a different world, far from showbiz, and maybe that's why Brigitte found in him something she'd lost long ago: normalcy, or at least a possible version of it. Over the years, the house became an almost symbolic refuge. It wasn't just a physical space, it was a clear boundary. Here ends the character. Here starts the person. Bernard was the guardian of that boundary, and now, after she left, that boundary seemed more fragile than ever. He knew cameras, theories, interpretations would come. He knew many would claim the truth about her last moments as if privacy was a public debt. But the truth, Bernard thought, isn't always a fact. Sometimes it's an atmosphere. And the atmosphere of those final days wasn't tragic in the usual way. It was calm, tired, yes, deeply human. Brigitte didn't live her last days like a star fading out, but like a woman who had made all her choices and was at peace with them. Meanwhile, outside, the inevitable questions started. What did she die of? Was she sick? Who was with her? Bernard heard some of them repeated on news with the sound off. They seemed fair questions, but incomplete, because none of them got to the heart of it. How someone watched by millions managed to disappear in the end without a show. And there was the real puzzle. Brigitte Bardot went down in history for being seen, but she left the world not wanting to be looked at. Bernard felt his last job was to honor that, not add noise, not offer versions that would feed the gossip, protect the silence like something sacred. At some point in that long day, he realized the grief waiting for him wouldn't just be personal. He'd have to live with the world's grief too, a loud, conflicting one full of other people's ideas. But his would be different. His would be that of a man who lost the woman he shared the end of the road with, not a historical figure. And so, while outside the flood of tributes and arguments started, Bernard stayed in the house, in that space where Brigitte had chosen to live and die away from the spotlight. Because if he'd learned anything from her, it was that freedom isn't negotiated, not even in the last moment. The weeks before didn't announce the end with drama. There was no sudden fall or a scene that could be summed up in one line. Instead, there was a slow wearing down, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. Bernard noticed it in the small things, the tiredness that came earlier, the longer silences, the way Brigitte stroked the animals like she was fixing memories into their fur. She didn't talk about death. She never liked making it a topic. But she talked about time, about how little was left to waste on useless arguments, about the need to protect what mattered. Bernard understood that language was a kind of goodbye without words. It wasn't sadness. It was clear-headedness. During those weeks, the house became even more closed off. Fewer visits, fewer answered calls. Brigitte had spent her whole life defending herself from other people's interpretations. Now, with a weaker body, that defense became total. Bernard was the filter, the wall, the constant no, not out of harshness, but out of loyalty. He knew every intrusion, even small, stole her energy. Sometimes at night she looked at old photos, not to relive fame, but to recognize the young woman she'd been. Bernard watched her quietly, never asked what she felt. He learned there are questions that break the balance, and in those days, balance was everything. There were also short, almost casual talks that became important later. Comments about what to do with certain things, about the animals, about the house, about not turning her absence into a show. Bernard listened, remembered, nodded. He didn't make big promises, just took on the responsibilities. Meanwhile, the world started getting closer without knowing it. Journalists asking how she was, old friends popping up again, old opinions circulating. Bernard felt that pressure like a slow rising tide. He knew once the news broke, there'd be no control. That's why, in those weeks, he protected each day like it was the last quiet one. Brigitte seemed to sense it. At some point, without ceremony, she told him she regretted nothing. Not the early retirement, not the choices others never forgave. Living to please others is dying early, she murmured once, almost to herself. Bernard understood that line was a summary of her whole life. In the final days, the pace slowed even more. Mornings were shorter, afternoons longer. The garden was still there, the sea too. Nothing seemed changed, and yet everything was changing. Bernard sat close, but not on top of her, present but without invading. For them, it was always a silent agreement. When the decisive day finally came, there was no surprise, just a natural continuation of everything before. Bernard didn't think about headlines or dates. He thought about keeping promises, respecting, not betraying the way she'd chosen to go. Without scandal, without public explanation, without asking permission. And while the world got ready to talk about Brigitte Bardot one last time, Bernard knew his real task was just starting, because the hardest part wasn't going with her to the end, but protecting that end from the noise that would come after. The last night had no big ceremony. It wasn't a scene made to be remembered, and maybe that's why Bernard remembers it so clearly. The house breathed as always, the soft creak of wood, the distant murmur of the sea, the animals settling in their usual spots. Brigitte was awake but quieter. There was no fear in her eyes. There was a strange focus, like every move was being noted with final calm. Bernard spent most of the night close without talking. They'd learned to live with silence like others live with music. At some point, she asked for water. He brought it carefully. There were no over-the-top thanks, just a long-held look that said more than any words. Bernard knew then that look was a kind of closure, not a goodbye, but an acknowledgement. That was enough. The hours moved slowly. Sometimes Brigitte slept. Sometimes she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling, the room, the soft light. She didn't ask to call anyone, didn't want visits, didn't want speeches. Bernard respected every choice like he'd respected all the ones before. He knew that love, at that point, wasn't about doing more, but about not doing too much. At dawn, the light came in softly through the windows. The day didn't seem different from others, and that made it even harder. The animals moved carefully, like they understood something fragile was happening. Bernard briefly remembered how many times Brigitte had said she preferred the company of those who don't demand explanations. In that moment, that choice made total sense. The last hours had no memorable words, and Bernard thought, with almost cruel clarity, that the world would feel let down. They always expect a final line, a symbolic gesture, something quotable. But Brigitte didn't live to be quoted, and she didn't die for it either. Her ending was consistent with her life, private, contained, without show. At one exact moment, impossible to pin down, Bernard understood she wasn't there in the same way anymore. There was no shock, no alarm, just a deeper quiet. He stayed still, like any move could break something sacred. Time shrank. The world's noise vanished completely. He didn't cry right away. The crying came later, when the certainty settled. Bernard didn't think about the legend. He thought about the woman who laughed at certain silly things, who got mad easily and made up fast, who fiercely defended her right to live as she wanted. He thought about the house without her presence, about the animals who wouldn't understand the absence but would feel it. Later, when it was unavoidable to tell others, everything happened fast, too fast. Phones, procedures, measured words. Bernard did what was needed, said what had to be said, refused what wasn't necessary, gave no details. He didn't owe them. He knew from that moment the story would stop belonging to them. The world would do what it always does, take it over. But even then, in the start of that noise, Bernard held one firm decision: not to let Brigitte's ending be turned into emotional merchandise. He wouldn't offer pictures, wouldn't give stories that fed gossip. His last promise wasn't public. It was private. To care for the silence like she'd cared for it in life. As the hours passed, tributes came. Big words, rushed interpretations. Bernard heard them like distant rain. He didn't argue, didn't correct. He understood everyone needs their own version of goodbyes. His, though, was simple and crushing. She was gone. And yet, in the house something stayed. It wasn't her image or her fame. It was the mark of a life lived with consistency. Bernard walked in the garden, touched everyday objects, watched the animals settle. Again, he understood that absence can also be a kind of presence when it's full of meaning, because Brigitte Bardot didn't leave like the world imagined. She left as she wanted, and that was maybe her last act of freedom. The days after didn't bring comfort. Thus, brought contrast, a harsh contrast between the silence Bernard needed and the noise the world demanded. As soon as the news went public, the house stopped being just a house. It became a symbol. And symbols, Bernard knew well, never rest. Messages came from everywhere, some sincere, others automatic. Many written more for the sender than the receiver. Politicians, actors, activists, cultural groups. Everyone seemed to have something to say about Brigitte Bardot. Everyone wanted to define her. Bernard read little. He quickly learned that in those days reading too much was a kind of violence. Private grief and public grief don't move at the same speed. For Bernard, time had stopped in one specific room, in one last look, in a breath that was no longer there. For the world, time sped up. Tributes, debates, ideological discussions, old controversies brought back, like death was an excuse to reopen trials. Some called her an eternal legend, others a controversial figure. Bernard watched that battle from afar and thought both sides were wrong in the same way, because neither talked about the woman he knew in her last years. Neither talked about the Brigitte, who was tired, clear-headed, firm in her choices, who no longer needed to convince anyone. There were those who demanded details. How were her last hours? Was she aware? Did she suffer? Bernard refused to answer, not out of coldness, but out of respect. Brigitte had spent her whole life being watched. He wasn't going to let even her ending be picked apart like another show. Silence in that moment was a form of love. In the middle of that storm, the house closed again. The animals were still there, unaware of headlines but sensitive to the absence. Bernard understood then something he hadn't wanted to admit. Now he was alone in a mission they used to share. Protecting Brigitte's legacy didn't mean making her perfect. It meant keeping her from being simplified, neither saint nor villain, just human. Criticisms came too, some harsh, others predictable. Opinions using her name to push political, moral, ideological points. He'd respect that consistency even after her death. He wouldn't correct stories. He wouldn't join fights. Time, he thought, is fairer than any quick debate. In moments of deepest tiredness, Bernard wondered if he'd done enough, if he'd been a good partner, if he'd protected that last stretch well. But those questions had no clear answer. He only knew one thing. He'd been true to what she asked. And for Brigitte, being true always mattered more than approval. Little by little, the noise started to drop. Like it always does, headlines moved to other topics. Social media found new feelings. And in that drop, Bernard felt something like relief. Not because the pain went away, but because the world finally seemed to step back. That's when he realized Brigitte Bardot's real legacy wasn't just in movies or beauty or even animal causes. It was in her constant refusal to live a life that didn't feel like hers, in her ability to say no when the whole system asked for yes, in her choice to retire before being consumed. And Bernard, now alone, took on the last role left, not to tell her story to close it, but to let it stay open, imperfect, uncomfortable, like she was. Because there are lives that aren't explained. They're respected as days go by. Bernard started to understand something he hadn't expected. Silence has weight too. When the world's noise pulled back, a big, almost awkward space was left where Brigitte's presence used to be. It wasn't just her physical absence, it was the absence of a strong will that had shaped every decision, every boundary, every firm no. In that silence, Bernard thought a lot about love. Not the romantic love movies sold for decades, but the love that survives when lights go out. Loving Brigitte wasn't owning her or explaining her to the world. It was accepting she never belonged to anyone, not even those who loved her. It was going with her, without taming her, being there without invading, caring without taking over. He remembered old casual talks that now had unexpected weight. Brigitte used to say, freedom isn't defended with speeches, but with repeated actions, even when they cost something. Quitting movies young, saying what she thought, without worrying about fallout. Choosing loneliness over fake, loving animals without asking for understanding. That was her way of being. And Bernard understood his role had been simply not to mess with that consistency. Going with someone to the end doesn't mean leading or correcting them. It means walking beside, even if the path isn't the one you'd pick. Bernard learned it late, but he learned it well. In the last years, his presence wasn't a savior or a spokesperson. It was a quiet witness to a life closing as it had opened, without asking permission. He thought, too, about the word legacy. The world says it like it's a clear, neat thing ready to display. But Brigitte Bardot's legacy doesn't fit a comfortable definition. It's conflicting, uncomfortable, bright and dark at once. And maybe that's why it still causes such strong reactions even after she left. Because there are people whose consistency bothers more than any scandal. Bernard didn't want to freeze her in a final image. He didn't allow a staged scene, didn't offer final quotes. He understood the best way to honor her was not to turn her death into a story product, to let everyone remember her from their own place, without forcing one official version. Love at the end is also letting go. In the house, life went on. The animals needed care. The garden grew again. The sea kept its eternal routine. Bernard found comfort in that continuing. Brigitte had always believed the world doesn't stop for anyone, and accepting that is a kind of humility. Now that idea held him up. When he thinks of her, he doesn't picture her young or surrounded by flashes. He pictures her sitting, looking at the horizon with that mix of tiredness and clarity only those who've lived intensely without regrets have. He pictures her free and understands that freedom was her greatest work. Maybe, Bernard reflects, The real point of telling this story isn't to explain how Brigitte Bardot died, but how she lived to the end without betraying herself. How she left without giving her last space to the show. How she turned even death into an act of consistency, because there are endings that don't want applause, just silence. And in that silence, for the first time, Bernard feels he can let her go. There's one last thought Bernard didn't say out loud, but it stayed with him like a calm certainty. Fame promises staying power, but it almost never gives peace. Brigitte understood it before many. Staying isn't always resisting. Sometimes pulling back is the most radical freedom, choosing when to be quiet, when to close the door, when to live away from applause was her way of staying in charge of herself. The world talks about icons like they're statues. Brigitte refused to stay still. She changed skins, gave up what no longer fit, and fiercely defended her right to disappear when she wanted. In a time that mixes being seen with being valuable, her final choice was an uncomfortable and needed lesson. Nobody owes their privacy to the public, not even a legend. Bernard understood loving someone like that means accepting loss as part of the deal, not demanding explanations, not wanting endings tailored to others, going along to the edge and then letting go. The house, the animals, the sea, everything went on, and in that simple continuing, he found a kind of comfort. Life doesn't ask permission to keep going, but it thanks us when we leave it in order. Brigitte Bardot didn't look for redemption or forgiveness. She looked for consistency and held it to her last breath. Her story, doesn't end in a headline or a controversy. It ends in a quiet gesture of personal control. Maybe that's why her absence feels so heavy, because it reminds us that real freedom isn't being seen, but being able to leave.